This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Arts Council through the State of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sangeeta Ray, and I'm here with Manil Suri, mathematician and, of course, writer of two fabulous novels. And we are here for this edition of The Writing Life. Welcome, Manil. And I was wondering if you would like to start off by perhaps reading a small section from your second novel.
Oh, sure.
And once we
that'll set the
ball
rolling,
and then we can open it up and see what we want to do with it. Okay.
Yeah, the new novel is The Age of Shiva, and I've got the paperback which just came out, so that's kind of nice.
Right.
And I'm going to start at the beginning because that doesn't require any setup.
Right. Okay. Sounds good.
Every time I touch you, every time I kiss you, every time I offer you my body, Ashwin, do you know how tightly you shut your eyes as with your lips you search my skin? Do you know how you thrust your feet towards me, how you reach out your arms, how the sides of your chest strain against my palms? Are you aware of your fingers brushing against my breast, their tips trying to curl around something to hold on to, but slipping instead against my smooth flesh? Ashwin, do you notice the wetness emerge from my nipples and spill down the slopes of my chest? Is that your tongue that I feel? Are you able to steal a taste or two? Ashwin, your eyes still closed, drops of moisture dappling your nose. Do you know how innocent you look, how helpless, as I guide the nipple towards your mouth? For an instant I feel like teasing you, drawing my nipple across your lips, but only for a touch, and swinging it away, watching your tongue dart out in confusion, the fingers still opening and closing and curling, worry beginning to crinkle your face. And that helplessness, that exquisite helplessness in your expression, that need for my body, for the nipple that is yours, for the breast I've so cruelly taken away. Yes, love can be capricious, can it not, my sweet? But of course I relent before I even begin. Your look suffuses me with guilt. I let your mouth close around me. I feel the pressure of your gums, your lips. The power in your jaws surprises me. A little more strength and I can see there will be pain. Your tongue pulls against my nipple. So practiced, so persuasive, so determined. How does it know what to do? I feel myself responding. Each tug brings liquid flooding up, engorging my breast, pushing out into your insistent mouth. Your feet twist and turn against my belly as you feed. Your hands finally find purchase on my breast. Fingers splaying out around tiny palms, your orb, your world held in your hands. I lose myself in the rhythm of your intake. Am I imagining it? Or is there a parallel rhythm that echoes inside me? A longing that rises through my body and trembles under my skin. I feel myself flush. I feel the color spread through my chest. Then I see your face, your forehead losing its worry, your eyelids no longer wrinkled tight. I watch the smile trying to train the corners of your mouth, and the heat inside me turns into warmth. There is nothing, I think to myself, as you let go of my nipple and turn to me filled. Nothing that can be as satisfying as this. Afterwards, I lie next to you. You fit so well into my body. Before closing my eyes, I take one last look. Your eyes, your ears, your hands, your feet, all these I check to make sure they're still there, still intact. Even the tiny curl of your manhood, nestling so innocently between the fleshy fold of your thighs. All this I have created. All this has come from me.
So this was wonderful, right?
Thank
so
you.
I was wondering if you wanted to talk about what it meant for you to actually use the voice of a female character, as the kind of opening into this novel, which is so different from the first book, The Death of Vishnu. It's a different narrator.
Yeah.
So, and also starting with this scene that is a sexualized scene, and the reader realizes very quickly that this is actually a mother and a newborn baby. So we're just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about this sort of interestingly intimate opening of the novel.
Yeah. When I started thinking about this, I started thinking about the narrator, and I thought about a woman and her child, and I thought, how do I get into this character? And I read everything I could about motherhood, like the mother and son relation. I read, there's a classic text of Woman Born by Adrienne Rich. I read that. I read everything I could find. And then finally I said, okay, I need to step back because nothing's coming out. And at some point, this voice just emerged. And that was the voice of this woman with her child. And this is a scene that first came to my mind. And I just followed it. And I think the whole novel was me going into this woman, Meera, her name is, her mind, little by little, looking at the world through her eyes. Looking at her son through her eyes and feeling everything that she did. It was a very intense journey in some sense because, it took me 7 years to write this novel. And perhaps it's the, other than my mother, maybe it was the most, the longest relationship I've had with a woman. I don't know. But it was nice to be done with that too.
Yeah. I read somewhere in, when I was reading about the novels that you had intended this book to actually be about the son.
Exactly, yes.
So at what point did the shift occur, you think?
It occurred, the original thing was Shiva, it's the Age of Shiva. And Shiva is often called the erotic ascetic. He's called that because he withdraws from the world. And since he's unavailable, people who love him are just filled with this intense longing for him because they can't attain him. And so I thought that, okay, there'll be a central Shiva-like character who would be the son. Ashwin, his name is in the novel. And then there'd be three people who love him but can't really attain him in that same sense that they want. And there were these three different narrators. And I started writing about all of them. This was the first one, Meera. And I also wrote about the other two narrators, one of whom is his wife, later on, much later. And then Meera just became...
You mean the son's wife? So
yes, the son's wife, yes.
The book is not there, of course, doesn't exist in this book at
no,
all.
No, I wrote a few hundred pages about these other two narrators. But then Meera's voice was so intense. She basically at some point said, okay, get rid of the other two people. I am your heroine. And it's not even about my son, it's about me.
It's about her.
So she just took over, and with her, the whole idea of what's going on in the background with India's history, that took over as well.
So I just wanted to sort of put, even though this first novel, The Death of Vishnu, was written some years, as you said, 7 years ago, I thought maybe we could sort of talk about the Age of Shiva, but also sort of go back to Death of Vishnu.
Absolutely.
So what was interesting to me in reading the two novels is the way in which the political, as you said, is much stronger an element, or part of this novel than in the Age of Vishnu, So in the Age of Vishnu, it seems to be more about, it's much more contained in that sense. There's a building, there are the tenants, there are the people who live in limbo land, the landing. But by the end of the novel, you can see it bringing in politics, communalism, Hindu-Muslim tension. So, but when you were thinking about this novel, and you just said, even though it was her voice that took over, how did the politics, and what made you think about the incorporating this large fabric of India as it moves through independence all the way to Indira Gandhi? How did you imagine, as you were crafting this fiction, what would be your links and your connections?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, with the Death of Vishnu, I always conceived that as a snapshot. So it was, in the 80s or 90s perhaps, and it gave you a snapshot of the country at that time. And so the political situation was woven in, as you said, especially towards the end, Hindus and Muslims. With the Age of Shiva, there were several things that came into play. One was that I was trying to create a novel that was completely different. So I wanted something, much longer. The first novel takes place in the course of one day. And it's, all these people in this one building. And here I wanted to move from Rawalpindi to Delhi to Bombay. I wanted it to be over several decades. And so the natural thing was to examine what's happening in the background. the political part really came in when I really saw that, here was a character, Meera, who's only about 17 at the beginning of the novel. And the country is only 7 years old at the beginning of the novel.
Right.
And I said, it would be really nice to have this parallel track where this very immature woman is basically evolving through these decades. And in the background, you see how India is also evolving. From a very young country. You know, when I started the novel, I thought I'd write about the partition because my parents actually came from Rawalpindi during the partition. But then once I got to that, I said, well, there's so many other novels, so many great novels that have been written about that. Let's look at what happened a few years later, where these new ideas were springing up in India, where the first seeds of perhaps feminism, of religious nationalism as a political force were being sown. And follow these things instead. And so it was a very rich period, and it was natural to weave these in. I should just point out, though, that my mother is a history teacher, and history was always my worst subject. So it's only when I started reading up for this book that I really got immersed in it and just energized by it. I said, okay, I need to put this in the book.
And I think I like that about this novel a lot because, as I started reading it and I realized, oh, there's going to be this historical panorama opening up in front of us, and I was expecting to hear a lot about the partition. So what I liked about it, it's in some ways a novel actually that is almost after partition. In other words, it's at the birth of the nation, if you will. But perhaps, of course, the reader has a different point of entry. But to me, it seemed that the two strands, that in other words, your main narrator seemed unaffected in some ways, like her personal life, except for the fact that her father is such a secularist, and imagines himself as a significant player, if you will, in politics. But it seems to me that her life, it's circumscribed still by her marriage and her family, and that the politics of that, doesn't quite affect her. Like, whereas in Death of Vishnu, very interesting, even though those characters start off as being completely self-contained, the politics impinges on the lives. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. And I think in this novel, the politics plays a more subtle role in Meera's life. Because in some sense, there are no direct, involvements like you're saying. But on the other hand, there are indirect things that happen. Like the partition is, of course, central to her life because that's what brings her to Delhi. And then, the war with Pakistan, that actually ends up, there's a central character who dies in that. And then the emergency, that also, I looked at how that can affect her life. And there's this other person, Arya, who comes to her house.
So the rise of Hindu nationalism, you see that too, Arya.
So what I wanted to show was really that, like most people, most of us are really bystanders in the kind of tableau of history. But history comes and bites us. And that's what happens with Meera. She's a very apolitical person. She's not a feminist heroine, but all of this is thrust upon her. So it's really like this innocent person and this big panorama behind her, and how they're interacting. And they're interacting in much subtler ways than you would normally find.
I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask a writer. Do you like Meera?
I have complete sympathy for her. Yes, I do like Meera, and that's a very good question to ask because I found Meera to be an immensely sympathetic character when I was writing her. And people from the Indian subcontinent usually find her that way too. But when the book went to the editing stage and I started showing it to people in the US, I was just surprised by how little sympathy some readers had for her.
Why? What did they see that was different? How do you understand the two reactions?
I think what it is that we live in a place where women are very assertive, and they have a lot of freedoms, and they have a lot of opportunities. And this is set in the 40s, 50s, 60s in India, where that just wasn't the case. And there's also this patriarchy in India, which is very debilitating in some ways. And so Meera is always trying to react against her father. She always opposes everything he does, because that's the only way she can assert herself.
And the father sees himself as being benevolent.
Exactly.
He wants to, and one could say he wants to advance his daughter's careers, education, but it's his path, not hers.
It's exactly,
Right.
yes. And
Right.
so in that sense, he's also, he's also a negative influence
Right.
because he's kind of stifling.
Right. Right.
But what I was amazed by was that several readers, they said, okay, the father is right. Why doesn't she do what he does?
Oh, really?
What he tells her to.
I see.
And so it was.
So they missed the subtlety of the.
Yeah, I don't know. It's it's like each reader will bring
Right.
their own experiences to it.
Right.
And so they wanted Meera to be more assertive.
Assertive, yeah.
But she's assertive, but in a very passive aggressive way.
Different way, yeah.
So that subtlety was so we actually went back and
Right.
we actually changed little things here and there, to try and bring that out more.
Right. I did love the fact that Meera's mother, after years of being imprisoned by her father, becomes this sort of radical Hindu sort of movement and sort of goes against her husband.
Exactly.
But she's the one who can ultimately rescue him,
Yes,
right, after
yes,
during the
right.
emergency. So I thought that was kind of interesting that, whereas Meera is maybe not political, how the mother becomes more and more
Exactly, yeah,
politicized.
yeah.
So to me, that was kind of an interesting narrative. To make another connection, perhaps, between the two novels, it seems to me that in Death of Vishnu, I personally couldn't connect, I found the characters, and of course, because there are people I know, I can recognize these people because if you lived in India for as long as we have, you recognize these people, the way we take, sort of class distinctions for granted, the way we kind of oppress without thinking we're not realizing we are oppressive. But would it be, maybe you can sort of correct me if I'm wrong, the characters in the Death of Vishnu seem misanthropic. Like, the community kind of falls apart. Here are people who've lived together, but there's a kind of disconnect. They're in competition with each other over the kitchen, over butter, over ghee, but they're also in competition with their lives, right? And so it seems to me, I felt this is such the representation of the characters seemed so, they seem so dysfunctional. As if you think of the apartment as a family unit, then you come to Age of Shiva, and the family is completely dysfunctional in ways like I think Indian families are. It's a word that we learn when we come to the US, but it's a dysfunctional family. But at the end of the novel, there's this wonderful connection between Meera and her friend. Right? And so the novel actually shifts the focus, and she she's enabled now by this friend, right, who's Muslim, who comes together. Do you see that difference in the two novels or not? Or is this something only the reader, with her biases, picks up?
Well, I think, again, the first novel, as I said, is a snapshot of India. And I think in India, what happens is that people are divided in so many ways, in terms of language, caste, religion, social class, skin color, whatever. And so that's what I was trying to represent in this building, which is really a microcosm of the country. That these people are fighting, and they're fighting over simple things like space or money, and that they have limited resources. So they're, in some sense, they're trying to do the best they can. And somehow they get along. I mean, okay, they're misanthropic and they're fighting with each other.
Do you think they are misanthropic?
Not misanthropic as such. I think they're just guarding their own territory. They're trying to make sure that they have enough. Like, even from the first instance where Mrs. Asrani has to really think about how much she can afford to give Vishnu, whether she has the money to get an ambulance or not. So they're trying to do the best they can under these circumstances. And that's what sort of keeps the country together in some sense, I think, because India is such a amazingly diverse place that these differences actually make sure that due to these differences, any social movement has a hard time spreading. And so, you don't have pieces of the country flying apart because there are all these layers of people who kind of keep it together because of the differences. So unity in diversity. So that's what I was trying to project in the first level.
But you do see the shift in the Age of Shiva at the end. I love that connection between the two women. I thought that was so beautiful.
And there was a previous connection too with Sandhya, who's the widow.
Yes.
So she
Arya's wife.
Arya's wife, yes.
But that was more, it seemed in some ways a kind of a debilitating connection, right? Because would you say, whereas this last one seemed a positive?
I think in that sense, yes, because Meera had to grow up. And so I think it is Zaida, the Muslim woman, who really helps her finally,
Yes.
you know, at the end, she still hasn't quite grown up.
Yes.
I mean, she's
Yes.
still just glimpsing
Right.
what is in her
Right.
future.
Right.
And there, I think what I really wanted to do is, you know, there are these novels where you have these very noble women.
Right.
That, you know, and I love these novels.
Yes.
They're great reads. But,
Yeah.
you know, the noble woman comes, she's put upon by all these
Right.
adversities,
Nah.
and then she triumphs at
Right.
the
You
end.
don't want that, yes.
And I didn't
Too
want
easy,
Meera to
and
be
it's
like
too
that.
easy.
And
It's too easy.
Meera is a very, you know, she has her faults,
And
you'll
she's very
see them.
complex. I
She's very
love the fact that
complex,
she's a
yeah.
complex character. She's a very, I really think you sort of did a marvelous job. I'm not sure I like Meera, but I thought that, but that's the whole point. I'm not sure I like her because I'm not sure I'm supposed to like her, right? I mean, in other words, it's easy to say, oh, I like her, I don't like her, but she's a very complicated, complex character. And even in the end, we still don't know how she's going to resolve her relationship with her. But I did like the ending. And I also like the fact that you ended the novel with her going back to the university. I thought that was a very marvelous thing. You know, she's struggling, but to put the woman in the university setting, I don't know if it was deliberate. I thought it was, to me, you know, as a woman,
and
as
academics,
as
perhaps.
academics, but I also felt like that's what you have to do. You have to go there and to get it. I want to sort of shift gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about sexuality. I say it seems like both your novels, you know, the piece that you read, and then we have different, you know, and it's a very risk that you've taken, you know, sort of trying to uncover what is always exists, I think, in this sort of close relationships with mother and son. And I wanted to see how you work that out, this sort of, and there is that moment of crisis in the novel, right? Where there is that possibility of this sort of crossing that barrier, that becoming incestuous, and they both walk away. But the son walks away more, it seems. Did you want to talk a little bit about that and how that was received, or how you conceived, and why that was significant for your novel?
Yeah, I think you know, there's this parallel strand of mythology in the novel with Shiva and his spouse Parvati. And there's this wonderful little myth about Parvati where Shiva is the ascetic, so he goes off, he's unattainable, and she gets tired of waiting for him. So one day she goes into the woods and she uses little bath water and pieces of her own skin, and she makes this little boy. And this boy is so wonderful, so delightful, that she spends all her time in his company.
That's right.
And she gets so close to him that she forgets all about Shiva. They start frolicking around in the woods with each other.
And of course, in our mythology, we have a lot of that, right?
We have a lot of that. If you look at the baby Krishna and his mother, and it's such a voluptuous scene, which is so different from Mary and Jesus.
We don't have the sort of consecration of the Virgin.
Exactly, yes. And so that's one thing that I wanted to bring out. But also, this, I've noticed it in my own family with my cousins and so on, that there is this very strong bond between mothers and sons especially. And so I was taking that to its natural conclusion. Like, where would it go to? You know, to present this obsessive love that Meera has. She's put all her happiness into the son. So that's the logical conclusion. And so you're taking it a few steps beyond what might happen.
I think well, I know we probably have to sort of shift gears, and we have a few minutes left. I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about your art of crafting. I mean, this is a writer's life. I mean, how do you imagine your, you know, how would you talk about what it means to be a writer? How do you craft your fiction? Do you have schedules? What do you think about? You know, rather than talking about the books that were published, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means to be a writer who's also a mathematician.
Yeah, well, it's been great because I think I started writing as a sort of a break from math because they're so different. So I started with a short story. I wrote several short stories over many years, and none of them got published except for one I was mentioning in a Bulgarian
So there's
journal.
hope for those everybody who's listening.
Oh yeah,
keep working at it.
Just collect all those rejections, and you know they'll make nice wallpaper or something. And then what happened was I started working on this novel, and the way the first novel evolved was it was supposed to be a short story, but I couldn't finish it. So I decided to make an outline, and I thought, okay, these floors of this building, you know, they're going to have certain types of characters.
That's right.
And that's how that novel evolved. When I came to the second one, I again had this wonderful outline, but as I mentioned, Meera just took over. So I think that's part of the fun of being a writer, that you never know where your characters are going to go, but you always have to follow them. I think with the first novel, there was this character, Mr. Jalal, and he sort of misbehaved, but I had to follow him. And Meera, of course, was completely her own mind, so I just followed her.
No, I sort of love the fact that I'm an avid reader of British Victorian novels, and going back to the 18th century, so I love the fact that you have a male writer who has a female protagonist. I was thinking of all the famous writers, Daniel, Defoe, Richardson. They all had these famous, some of the famous women in the corpus of British fiction have been women sort of created by men. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see that over here as well. So, and this is of course a trilogy, Vishnu, we've got Shiva, so is there a Brahma in the offing?
Yes, there is Brahma, but I'm torn between the fact that Brahma is sort of a more literary construct. He's only in the Trinity because you need a creator.
Yes.
The real third part of the Trinity is the Devi, the mother goddess.
Right.
So I'm trying to decide whether the title will have Devi or Brahma in it. But what I do know is that this has really become not just a trilogy about mythology, but also about India.
Right.
You know, the second book shows how India progressed to its current stage. So the next book is really going to project things into the future a little, like how can this story end? Like what might happen tomorrow? Which of course is a thankless kind of task, but you know, that's what I'm.
So do you go back to India often, sort of to keep busy books?
Yes. My mother is still there, and so last year I was there 3 times, and you know, this year I'll be there 2 or 3 times.
So do you ever imagine writing a novel that's set in the U.S.?
I do.
Because you've lived here for so long.
Yeah. And you know, the first short stories that I wrote, they were all set in the U.S. And then it was only when I started writing about Vishnu that I suddenly found my voice, so to speak. I have written a couple of short stories about mathematicians, which you know are set in the U.S. So you know that would probably be something that I would pursue.
So now that you have sort of a reputation, maybe you can go back and collect some of the short stories and that you wrote.
No, I don't want anyone to see them.
So you see that. So you feel you've matured tremendously.
You can see it from story to story. That okay, this. Oh my God, I would never write that now.
I see.
The first story I wrote was something called Unfulfilled Expectations. And when you read it, you said, well, whose expectations were unfulfilled? And it turned out that you as the reader. So there was a little twist, but you know, it's such an awful story.
Really?
Of course, that time I thought, okay, should I send it to the Atlantic or the New Yorker? And luckily I did.
Right. So thank you again, Manil, for coming and participating so early in the morning for this version. I hope you had a good time. I certainly did.
Yeah, so, this was great. Thank you. Thank you for this great interview.
Great, So thanks everybody for watching and this edition of The Writing Life. I hope you had as good a time as we did, and I hope you'll keep watching and supporting this great cause. Thank you. Thank you.